Okay, so this is the actual subject in which I have my graduate degrees in ecology, not community ecology itself, but community ecology is probably the aspect of ecology in which people are most familiar with, and that is the interactions between organisms. But first, let's digress back to what is ecology. Ecology is the study of the interaction between organisms, so we are looking at the living things, the organisms there, and their environment. And now your environment can be biotic, the living things around it, or it can be abiotic, the things which are not living in their environment, including the soil, the air, the temperature, the wind. All of these things interact with organisms and provide conditions for or against their existence in their life. Okay, so we mentioned some of those biotic and abiotic factors. Now, there are different branches within ecology. Again, we're going to study community ecology, which is the interaction of organisms within a defined place. So not just one species or one population, but populations and their interactions between them. So here we have mushroom interacting with a dead decaying tree. You can see some lichens and some mosses and some other things in this area. This is a community of species interacting. Here we have another pool in the desert. There are algae and grasses and shrubs and other things all growing within the same area, so that would be a community. Ecosystem ecology, which is not one we are going to get into in too much depth, and studies a larger scale of the ecosystem. So the dynamics and processes within an ecosystem, especially the energy inputs and chemical flow. So hydrology, how the water flows through an ecosystem, the sunlight and temperature and other things that are affected there as well. We're going to again focus on ecosystem ecology, but first, what are some of these terms you're going to hear in ecology that are important? One is an ecosystem. Ecosystem is used in a number of different disciplines, but in a biological discipline, it means the sum of abiotic and biotic factors, living and non-living factors, including and especially bacteria, which are prevalent all over, that affect living organisms in a localized environment. A community, populations of organisms living in a defined area. Habitat, so this is the physical place where an organism lives. You can have a microhabitat, very small little piece within a larger landscape, or you can have a macrohabitat. And the niche, this is the role that an organism plays within an ecosystem. What are the resources it needs to survive, both biotic and abiotic? So what are resources in an organism or in an ecosystem? What are the things that allow life to occur? Well, of course, you've got nutrients. You have to have light in some respect or some access to light, which is originally going to provide the elements for life. There are some exceptions to that. You do need space, some sort of substrate for things to attach to. Oxygen or carbon dioxide in most instances, right? Inorganic compounds, which are important for synthesizing proteins, and phospholipid bilayers and the macromolecules, which are important for life. Limiting resources, then, are those that are in such short supply that they limit the growth of the population. So what are some of the limiting resources you see here? Well, in the desert, of course, the biggest limiting resource is water. In the eastern deciduous forest, and I don't think this is an eastern deciduous forest, but that's what we have around here, it may be space or access to sunlight, or depending on the organism, it's going to be a number of different things. In the intertidal zone, so the period of the shore, which sometimes is covered in water, and then as the tide goes out, it's not. There it's going to vary depending on the time of day. It may be access to water, maybe space in this instance, right? All these muscles are squeezed together and they're fighting for just space. All right, so community ecology is mostly then looking at interactions between organisms. And an interaction can be positive, negative, or neutral. In competition, by definition, you have two organisms which negatively affect each other. They're competing for something, and they both want it, and because there's a limited amount of it, they'll have a negative association there. Predation is a positive, where the exploitation of one organism benefits the other, positive, negative. Symbiosis, then, or we have kind of two dependent organisms, and you can have a positive positive, a neutral positive, or a positive negative symbiosis. All right, competition, we'll start at the top, occurs when both organisms are negatively affected by their cohabitation. They're both going for a limiting resource. Intraspecific competition means within the species. So here we have hermit crabs fighting for one shell. That's intraspecific competition. Interspecific competition is when you have competition between species. So we have purple sea urchin and this darker sea urchin. I don't know what this is, black sea urchin. They're both competing for access to food in the same area. So that's interspecific. In interspecific competition, there are a couple of major theories which seem to be valid in most ecosystems. And the first is the principle of competitive exclusion, which is that no two species can inhabit the same niche, the same resource use, or at least not the exact same resource use at the same time and place. And so this results in resource partitioning, where if there is overlap in that niche, that they use that resource in a different way at a different time, so that the competition is avoided or partitioned among them. So some examples of this are different anole species, or species of lizard. A. distichus here lives on open areas that are exposed to the sun, whereas A. insulatus is on interior shaded areas. So they live in the same area of this, on this forest, but they partition their resources so they don't have the exact same niche. Okay, we also have different types of niches. An ecological niche is the sum total of all the resources that a species uses in its environment. So what is its food, what is its shelter requirements, and so on and so forth. A fundamental niche then is the resources a species is capable of using. Okay, so in this instance we have this Thymalus species, and its fundamental niche is that it can go up and down the intertidal zone into the low tide area. It can actually access all of these resources. But its realized niche is what it actually uses in the presence of other species. And so if you put in this Balanus species, it actually can't go all the way up to this high tide area, but it outcompetes the Thylamus species in this lower tide area. And so Balanus causes the realized niche of the Thymalus species to be much lower than its fundamental niche. So competition then affects the ability of the niche, or the realized niche. All right, the second principle, predation. This is where you have one species consuming the other, right? In an herbivore, the prey is the autotroph, a plant of some sort. In a carnivore, the prey is a non-autotroph. So they don't eat plants, they eat other animals. Predation creates then among an ecosystem lots of different interactions between species, and creates this trophic structure. And you may have learned this in grade school as a food chain, but in reality it's more like a food web, because not every species just eats one thing that eats one thing that eats another thing, right? They actually eat a variety of things depending on what's available, which eats a variety of things, and so it creates this web, this complex interaction. Autotrophs still, however, are on the base or on the bottom of the food webs. They are the primary producers. Heterotrophs then are every level above that. So primary consumers eat primary producers, what's that supposed to say? Sorry. And they are those herbivores. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. Those are carnivores. Tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers. These are top predators. And then you also have detritivores, which eat dead and decaying matter. And they're important for nutrient recycling and are sometimes exhibited on food webs as well. All right, so here's our food chain. In reality, again, it's not this simple. But we have our primary producers at the bottom. In land, it's plants. In sea, it's mostly these photosynthetic plankton. Zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. Herbivores eat the plants. And then you have different levels of fish until you get to your top predator, or different levels of animals till you get to your top predator there. Now, at each level, you have the loss of abundance in these species. And the reason that is because of this energetic hypothesis. Basically, the food chain, how many levels you can have, is limited by the inefficiency of energy transfer along the train. So whenever something eats something, it doesn't use all of the energy available. Some of it is lost as wasted byproduct, usually as heat. So at each level, you have less and less available. And so you have much less tertiary consumers, 10 times less than secondary consumers. Essentially, you have a 10% on average energy use available for the next level. And this creates this food pyramid, not the one you learned in grade school, but showing the abundance of each of the trophic levels. All right, this is why there are less predators than primary producers, and also why it takes much less energy to eat a plant-based diet than it does an animal-based diet. All right, symbiosis. This is where one species is living in or on another. The symbiont is the smaller partner, and the host is the larger. Generally speaking, it's not doesn't always go according to size. So these clownfish are the symbiont to this sea anemone, which is the host. Here's a cleaner shrimp and an eel, symbiont and host. Here's a remora and a large manta ray, symbiont and host. All right, there are different types of symbioses. First is mutualism. This one's fun. Here we have a cleaner fish, which eats the little insects and dead decaying cells. There aren't a lot of insects there, but whatever. Parasites may be infecting the skin of this eel. This fish will come and eat it off. It gets a free meal, and the eel gets a cleaning. And so both of them are benefiting from this relationship. Commensalism is where one species benefits and it doesn't really seem to have an effect on the other. So an example is these barnacles, which live on whales, doesn't seem to really negatively affect the whales. They can still swim around and get their food and everything they need. But the barnacle gets a place to live. All right, the third one, parasitism or pathogenism, is where one species is harmed, usually not killed, but still has a negative association with that other animal. So tapeworms in the guts of whales or humans or any other animal is a parasitic relationship. It's feeding off of it without killing it. There are facultative symbioses where it is convenient but not necessary. So this little bird, which kind of eats the insects off this impala, that's probably a facultative relationship. It could find bugs if it needs to, but they're more abundant and easy to find on the antelope. Or an obligate symbiosis, necessary for life. So these lampreys here, they cannot live if they can't find a host to feed off of. So that's an obligate symbiosis.